Gregor's sister began to play. The father and mother, from either side, intensely watched the movements of her hands. Gregor, attracted by the playing, ventured to move forward a little until his head was actually inside the living room. He felt hardly any surprises at his growing lack of consideration for the others. There had been a time when he prided himself on being considerate, and yet, just on this occasion, he had more reason than other. That with thick in his room, it rose into the air of a sightless movement. He was too covered with dust, fluff, and hair, and remnants of food trailed from him, caught on his back, along with his sides. His indifference to everything was much too great for him to turn on his back and scrap himself on a carpet. As once he had done several times a day, and in spite of his condition, no shame deterred him from advancing a little over the spotless floor of the living room. To be sure, no one was aware of him. The family was entirely absorbed in the violin playing. The lodgers, however, who first of all stationed themselves, hands in pockets, much too close behind the music stand so that they could all have read the music, which must have bothered his sister, as soon retreated to the window, half whimpering, with down-bent heads, and stay there while his father turned an anxious eye on them. Indeed, they were making it more than obvious that they had been disappointed in their expectation of hearing good and or enjoyable violin playing, that they had more than enough of the performance and only out of a contrary suffered and a continued disturbance of their peace. From the way they all kept blowing the smoke of their cigars high in the air through nose and mouth, one could divine their interaction. And yet Gregor's sister was playing so beautifully. Her face leaned sideways intensely, and sadly her eyes followed the notes of music. Gregor crawled a little further forward and lowered his head to the ground so that it might be possible for his eyes to meet hers. Was he an animal that music had such an effort upon him? And he felt as if the way that were opening before him into the unknown, a nourishment he carved. He was determined to push forward till he reaches his sister, to pull at her skirt, and so let her know that she was to come into his room with her violin, for no one here appreciated her playing as he would appreciate it. He would never let her out of his room, at least not so long as he lived. His rival appearance would become, for the first time, useful to him. He would watch all the doors of his room and once spit at the intruders. But his sister should need no considerant. She should stay with him with her own free will. She should sit beside him on the sofa, bend down her ear to him, and hear him convey that he had the firm intention of sending her into the consideration, and that, but for his mishap, last Christmas surely was long past, he would have announced it to everybody without allowing a single objection. After his confession, his sister would be so touched that he would burst into tears, and Gregor would then raise himself to her shoulder and kiss her on the neck, which now that she went to business, she kept free from of any ribbon or collar. Mr. Samsa, cried the middle lodger to Gregor's father, and pointed without wasting any more words at Gregor. Now working himself slowly forward, the violin fell silent. The middle lodger first smiled to his friends with a shake of a hand and then looked at Gregor again. Instead of driving Gregor out, his father seemed to think it more needful to begin by smoothing down the lodgers. Although they were not at all agitated and apparently found Gregor more entertaining than the violin playing. He hurried toward them and spreading out his arms, trying to urge them to back into their own room at the same time to block their view of Gregor. They now began to be really a little angry. Could not tell whether because of the old man's behavior or because it had just dawned on them that all unwillingly they had such a neighborhood as Gregor's next door. They demanded an explanation of his father. They waved their arms like him, tugged uneasily at their breads, and only with a reluctance back towards their room. As to Gregor's sister, she basically played out things until it was silently, completely, abruptly broken off, come to life again, pull herself together all at once after standing for a while, holding the violin and bowing nervously, hanging hands and staring at her music. Pushed her violin into the lap of her mother, who was still sitting in her chair fighting astonishingly for breath, and then ran into the lodger's room, to which they were now being shepherded by their father rather than more quickly than before. One could see the pillows and blankets on the bed flying under their accustomed fingers and be laid in order. Before the lodgers had actually reached their rooms, she had finished making the beds and slipped out. The old man seemed more once to be so possessed by his numerous self-assertiveness that he was forgetting all the respect he had shown him to his lodgers. He kept driving them on until, in the very door of the bedroom in the middle of the lodger, stomped his foot loudly on the floor and so brought him to the halt. "I beg to announce," said the lodger, lifting one hand and looking into Gregor's mother and sister, "that because of this disgusting conditions prevailing in this household and family," here he spat on the floor with an epithet brevity, "I give you notice on the spot. Naturally, I won't pay you a penny for the day I have lived here. On the contrary, I shall consider bringing an action of damage against you, based on claims, believe me, that will easily susceptible of proof." He ceased and stared straight in front of him, as if he expected something. In fact, his two friends at once rushed into the breach, but with these words, "And we too give notice on the spot." On that he seized the door handle and shut the door with a slam. Gregor's father, groping with his hands, staggered forward and fell into his chair. It looked as if he was stretching himself. There was of his ordinary evening nap, but he marked jerkings of his hands, which they were as if uncontrollable, showed that he was far from asleep. Gregor had simply stayed in quietly at all time, on the spot where he lodgers had espied him. Disappointment at the failure of his plans, perhaps. Also, the weakness arising from his extreme hunger made it possible for him to move. He feared with a fair degree of certainty. At any moment, the general tension would discharge itself on a combined attack upon him, and he lay waiting. He did not react even to the noise made by the violin as it fell off of his mother's lap from under her trembling fingers and gave out of a recent note. "My dear parents," said his sister, slipping her hand on the table by the way of an introduction. "Things can't go on like this. Perhaps you don't realize that I do. I won't utter my brother's name in the presence of this creature. And so I say this. We must try to get rid of it. We've tried to look after it and to put up with it as far as humanly possible. I don't think anyone could reproach us in the slightest." "She is more than right," said Gregor's father to himself. His mother, who was still choking for a lack of breath, began to cough hollowly into her hand with a wild look in her eyes. His sister rushed over to her and held her forehead. His father thought seems to have lost their vengeance. At Greti's words, he sat more upright, fingering his servant's cap that they lay among the plates still lying on the table from the lodger's supper, and from time to time looked at the still form of Gregor. "We must try to get rid of it." His sister now said unexpectedly to her father, since her mother was coughing so too much to hear a word, "You'll be the death of both of you. I could see that coming. When one has to work as hard as we do, all of us, one can't stand this cultural torment at home on top of it. At least, I can't stand it any longer." And she burst into such a passion of sobbing that her tears dropped on her mother's face, where she wiped them off menacingly. "My dear," said the old man, sympathetically with evident understanding, "but what can we do?" Gregor's sister merely shrugged her shoulders to indicate the feelings of helplessness that had now overmastered her during her weeping fit in contrast of her former confidence. "If he could understand us," said her father, half questioningly. Greti, still sobbing vehemently, waved a hand to show her how unthinkable that was. "If he could understand us, then perhaps we might come to some agreements with him. But as it is, he must go. That's the only solution. Father, you must try to get rid of the idea that this is Gregor. The fact that we believe it's for so long is the root of all our trouble. But how could it be Gregor? If this were Gregor, he would have realized long ago that human beings can't live with such a creature, and he would have gone away. He would have gotten away on his own records. Then we wouldn't have any brother. But he'd be able to go on living to keep his memory in honor. As it is, this creature persecutes us, drives away our lodgers, obviously wants the whole apartment to himself,
They would have all sleep in the gutter. Just look, Father. He's at it again.
And in an accent of a panic that was quite incomprehensible to Gregor, she even quitted her mother, literally thrusting the chair from her as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than stay so near to Gregor, then rushed behind her father, who also rose up, being simply upset by her agitation, and have speared his arms out as if to protect her. Yet Gregor had not the slightest intention of frightening anyone, far less than his sister. He had only begun to turn around in order to crawl back to his room, but it was certainly a startling operation to watch, since because of his disabled condition, you could not execute the difficult returning movements except by lifting his head and then bracing it against the floor over and over again. He paused and looked around. His good intentions seems to have been recognized. The alarm had only been momentary. Now they were all watching him in melancholy silence. His mother lay in a chair, her legs skillfully outstretched and pressed together, her eyes almost closing for sheer awareness. His father and his sister were sitting beside each other, his sister arms around an old man's neck. Perhaps I can go on turning around now, thought Gregor. Began his labors again. He could not stop himself from panting with the effort, and had no pause now and then to take breath, nor did anyone harass him. He was left entirely to himself. When he had completed turn around, he began at once to crawl straight back. He was amazed at the distance separating him from his room. I could not understand how in his weak state he had managed to accomplish the same journey so recently, almost without remarking it. Intent on crawling as fast as possible, he barely noticed that not a single word, not ejaculations from his family, interfered with his progress. Only when he was already in the doorway he turned his head around, not completely, for his neck muscles were getting stiff, but enough to see that nothing had changed behind him except that his sister had risen to her feet. His last glance fell on his mother, who was not quite overcome by sleep. Hardly was he well into his room when the door was hastily pushed shut, bolted, and locked. The sudden noise in his rear startled him so much that his little legs gave beneath him. It was his sister who had shown such haste. She had been standing already, waiting, and had made a light spring forward. Gregor had not even heard her coming, and she cried, "At last!" to her parents as she turned the key in the lock. "So, what now?" said Gregor to himself, looking around in the darkness. Soon he made a discovery that he was now unable to stir a limb. This did not surprise him. Rather, it seemed unnatural that he should ever actually have been able to move on these feeble little legs. Otherwise, he felt relatively comfortable. True, his whole body was aching, but it seems that the pain was gradually growing less and would finally pass away. The rotten apple in his back was inflamed area around it, all covered with a soft dust, already hardly troubled him. He thought of his family with tenderness and love. The decision that he must disappear was one that he had held even more stronger than his sister, if that were possible. In the state of the vacant and peaceful meditation, he remained until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning, the first broadening in the light of a world outside the window entered his consciousness once more. Then his head sank into the floor of its own accord, and from his nostrils came the last faint flicker of his breath. When the chairwoman arrived early in the morning, and what beneath her strength and her impatience, she slammed all the doors so loudly, never mind how often she had been begged not to do so, and that no one in the whole apartment would enjoy any quiet sleep after her arrival. She noticed nothing unusual as she looked her customary peep into Gregor's room. She thought he was lying motionless on purpose, pretending to be in the sulks. She created him with every kind of intelligence. Since she happened to have a long-handled broom in her hand, she tried to tickle him up with it from the doorway. With that too produced no reaction, she felt provoked and poked at him with a little harder, and only when she had pulled him along the floor without meeting any resistance was her attention arose. It did not take her long to establish the truth of the matter. Her eyes widened, she let out a whistle, yet did not waste much time over it, but tore open the door of the Sama's bedroom and yelled into the darkness at the top of her voice. "Just look at this. It's dead. Lying there dead and done for." Mr. and Mrs. Samsa started up in their double bed, and before they realized the nature of the chairwoman's announcement, had some difficulty in overcoming the shock of it. But then they got out of bed quickly, one on the other side, Mrs. Samsa throwing a blanket over his shoulders, Mrs. Samsa in nothing but her nightgown. In this way, they entered Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the door of the living room opened too, where Grete had been sleeping since the advent of the lodgers. She was completely dressed as if she had been to bed, which seems to be confirmed also by the paleness of her face. "Dead?" Mrs. Samsa looking questioningly at the chairwoman. Although she would have investigated for herself, and the fact was obvious enough without investigation. "I should say so," said the chairwoman, providing her words by pushing Gregor's corpse a long way to the one side of her broomstick. Miss Sampson made a movement as if to stop her, but checking. "Well, now thanks to be God." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Grete, whose eyes never left the corpse, said, "Just see how thin he was. It's such a long time since he's been eating anything." The food came out again just as it was before, and then went in. Indeed, Gregor's body was completely flat and dry, as could only now been seen when it was no longer supported by the legs, and nothing prevented one from looking closely at it. "Come in beside us, Grete, for a little while," said Mrs. Sampson with a tremendous smile, and Grete, now without looking back at the corpse, followed her parents into their bedroom. The chairwoman shut the door and opened the window wide. Although it was early in the morning, her certain softness was so respectable. in the fresh air. After all, it was already the end of March. The three lodgers emerged from their rooms and were surprised to see no breakfast. "Where's our breakfast?" said the middle lodger provincially to the chairwoman. But she put her finger to her lips and hastily, without a word, indicated by gestures that they should go into Gregor's room. They did so and stood their heads in the pockets of their somewhat shabby cost. Around Gregor's corpse in the room where it was now fully light. At that door of the Samsa's bedroom and opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform, his wife on one arm, his daughter on the other. They all looked a little as if they had been crying. From time to time, Griti hid her face on her father's arm. "Leave my house at once." "What do you mean by that?" said the middle logger, taken somewhat aback from the feeble smile. The two others put their hands behind and then kept rubbing them together, as if in a gleeful expedition in a fight set to win, which they were bound to some come off the winners. "I meant just what I say," answered Mrs. Samsa, and advised in a straight line with his two companions towards the lodgers. He stood in his ground at first, quietly, looking at the door as if the thoughts were taking a new pattern in his head. "Then let us go, by all means," he said, looking up at Mr. Samsa, as if in a sudden access of humility he were expecting some renewed sanction for his decision. Mr. Samsa merely nodded very briefly once or twice with meaning eyes. Upon that lodger really did go the longest strides into the hall. His two friends had been listening and had quite stopped rubbing their hands for the brief seconds. In some moments and now went scuttling after him as if afraid that Mr. Samsa might get into the hall before them and cut him off from the leader. In the hall, there all three took their hats from the racks, their sticks from the umbrella stand, bowed in silence, and quieted the apartment. With a suspiciousness that proved quite unfounded, Mrs. Samsa and the two women followed them out of the landing. Leaning over the banister, they watched the three figures slowly but surely going down the long stairs, vanishing from sight and with a certain turn to the staircase on every floor, and coming into view again after a moment or so. The more they dwindled, the more Samsa families interested in them dwindled. And when the butcher boy met them and passed them on the stairs, coming up proudly with a tray on his hand, Mr. Samsa and the two women left soon the landing, and if a burden had been lifted from them, went back into their department. They decided to spend this day in resting and going for the stroll. They had not only deserved such a respite from work, but absolutely needed it. And so they sat down at a table and wrote 3 notes of excuses. Mr. Samsa to his board of management, Mrs. Samsa to her employee, and Griti to the head of her firm. While they were writing, the chairwoman came in to say that she was going now, since her morning work was finished, At first, they only nodded without looking up, and that they kept hovering there in their eyes irritably.
Well,
said Mr. Samsa. The chairwoman stood grinning in the doorway as if she had a great news to report the family, but meant not to say a word unless properly questioned. The small ostrich feather standing upright on her hat, which had annoyed Mr. Samsa well ever since she was engaged, was waving giddily in all directions.
well, what is it then,
Mrs. Samsa?
Oh,
Said the chairwoman.
just this. You don't need to bother about how to get rid of that thing next door. It has been seen to already.
Mrs. Samsa agreed to bend over the letters again, as if preoccupied. Mr. Samsa, who perceived that she was eager to begin describing in all in detail, stopped her with a decisive hand, but she was not allowed to tell her something that makes her concerned. She desperately remembered the great hurry she was in, obviously deeply huffled.
Bye, everybody.
She said, whirling off violently, and departed with a frightful slamming of doors. She'll be given notice tonight, said Mr. Samsa, but neither of his wife nor his daughter did he get any answers, for the chairwoman seemed to have shattered again the composure they had barely achieved. They rose, went to the window, stayed there, and clasped each other tight. Mr. Samsa turned in his chair to look at them, and quietly observed them for a little. Then he called out,
Come along now. Let bygones be bygones. And you might have some considerations for me.
The two of them complied at once, hesitated to him, caressed them, and quickly finished their letters. Then they all three left the apartment together, which was more than they had done for months, and went by tram into the open country outside the town. The tram, in which they were only passengers, was filled with warm sunshine. Leaning comfortably back in their seats, they canvassed their prospects for the future. It appeared on a closer inspections that these were not all that bad. For the jobs they have got, which so far they had never really discussed with each other, were all three amenable and likely to lead to better things later on. The greatest immediate importance in their condition would, of course, arise from moving to another house. They wanted to make a smaller and cheaper, but also better suited and more easily run apartment than they had one already, which Gregor had selected. While they were thus conversing, it struck both Mr. and Mrs. Samsa almost at the same moment, as they become aware of their daughter's increasing vacancy, that in spite of all the sorrow of recent time, which had made her cheeks pale, she had bloomed into a pretty girl with a good figure. They grew quieter and have unconsciously exchanged glances of complete arrangement. Having
come to the conclusion that it would soon be time to find a good husband for her. And it was like a confirmation of their new dreams and excellent intentions that at the end of their journey, their daughter sprang to her feet and first and scratched her young body.